Welcome everyone to this brief talk that I'm going to do today, which focuses mostly on my research regarding the pioneers of modern art in Malta, which is in 2 volumes, particularly the second volume published by Heritage Malta, which came out in November of 2019, just before we had the pandemic breaking out of the COVID. I want to speak about the extensive research that went into these 2 volumes and why I felt the need to do this particular work. What these 2 volumes provide is a framework for modern art history. Until these 2 volumes, we had very few publications, mostly articles, and nothing proper scientific, which brought together all the entire history of the movement of modernism in Malta. In so doing, I have identified the major artistic movements, because there was more than one, even though that many of these groups more or less had the same people working in them. And eventually, in some of these groups, we had very little information. I will talk about them very soon, like the Bottega, like Spectrum, like Vision, for example. We only speak mostly of Atelier or modern art group. And eventually, I will identify the protagonists, the pioneers, I call them, and some of their major works, which are discussed. And of course, I put all of this in a historical context and in a wider European context as well. In my preface for the second volume, I refer to an extremely important Maltese painter and writer and leader. He had a lot of qualities, by the name of Joseph M. Borchwire from Birkirkara. This particular artist will at some point provide a piece of writing, which I believe appeared in L'Orizzonte, the newspaper L'Orizzonte, which essentially means horizon, where he referred that now that many years have passed and he is aging and he's feeling the end is near, he decided that the groups should, or the modern art groups should collect all their information and data, particularly catalogs, photos, minutes of their several meetings, and these were to be deposited at the National Library Archives in Valletta. I discovered that this was never done. So I had no sources in order to be able to work regarding the history of these groups. So the first history, I got it from the artists themselves. Many of them were actually my teachers in different schools. At St. Joseph Secondary Technical School in Paola, many of them were teaching there. Eventually, I found them again at the Malta School of Arts. Then I found them when I was in the Faculty of Education. So, and eventually these were not only teachers, eventually they became my friends. They invited me to their studio. And I started to collect the information from them. They had photos, they had some newspaper cuttings, not that they were very important, but at least they allowed me to verify some dates. And of course, I had to cross-reference this with other sources, because I couldn't rely on just what they were saying. Some were even forgetting or were not sure of certain dates. And this is how I started. And therefore, I had to still go to the National Archives in Valletta, and I started to check a lot of information from sources that we hardly even consider today. I'm just going to mention a few, which all appear mostly in the bibliography. Publications like, for example, La Crociata, or the Malta Herald, or Il Popolo di Malta, A lot was very helpful, the Malta Government Gazette, because this provided a lot of dates, a lot of announcements, a lot of appointments about the programs, about the scholarships that were taking place at the School of Art. I consulted the Malta Artistica Illustrata, the famous Melita or Malta Letteraria, the famous Delfino, which was also very important, Il Meridiano di Roma, Malta Napoli, Corriere Mediterraneo, and of course the archives of the Malta School of Arts when it comes to the scholarships that were taking place and artists who studied there. One of the first groups that I discovered, which was not documented at all, and it dates back from 47, 48, that is prior to the modern art group, was the famous group called La Bottega, the workshop as it were. This was mainly the work of Frank Baldacchino, as well as some other friends. Eventually Frank Baldacchino will emigrate to Australia, then eventually will go to England. But lucky for us, he returned back to Malta, and I could speak with him in his last days of his life. And he had a lot of resources that he handed on to me. The other artists were Jerry Caruana, Xavier Privitera. These also unfortunately emigrated, and I traveled to Canada and found a lot of information about them as well, which is all available in the book. These artists actually met in the class of Carmelo Mangione during the printing and painting class that he organized at the Malta School of Arts. And Mangione, who was always very different from the rest of the staff, he was always talking already of Impressionism and modern movements, while the others were more concerned with traditional concerns, that he gave this new energy to his students, and they formed this group called Bottega. I document, of course, the important modern art circle exhibition, which took place in January of 1953. I document this by all the artists that took place. And although the information is rather limited, because many times these artists used to meet at the drapery shop of Antoine Camilleri's shop in Valletta called À la Ville de Lyon, but I came across postcards and some kind of correspondence that went through these meetings. Remember, many of these artists were working in Valletta, so it was very convenient to meet in Valletta at the drapery shop. I identify artists that we still do not know that much about, like John Fenech, for example, or Joe Camilleri, and of course Ugo Bonaro and Preca and others, which are all artists that still, till today, need to be studied. I cover their extensive exhibitions, and I cover eventually also the Atelier 56. It was called 56 because it was essentially founded in 1956. I came across, therefore, once I identified the movements, their important leaflets, brochures, including minutes of their meetings. They met regularly every month, and I managed to identify many of these minutes here and there from different artists who for some reason had a photocopy, or because they served as secretaries to the movement. I felt it important that all these minutes, brief as they are, with all important information and dates and the nature of what they were discussing, that they are all published and included in the 2 volumes that I'm talking about. They are printed on gray pages to distinguish from the white pages of the main text. And I put them there because I wanted to make sure this time they are not going to be lost, even though my intention is, when I finish my studies, that all these documents will be actually deposited in the National Library Archives in Valletta. So it was very important for me to document all of that. Only a few of the minutes I did not manage to find, There are a few gaps here and there, but essentially, I think we have the entire collection, which gives us a very good explanation of what was going on. These meetings gave a lot of important, world-renowned historian Eric Newton, who was invited to come and lecture at the British Institute in Valletta. This took place on December 17th in 1956, which eventually, after he saw the works of the Maltese artists, Eric Newton invited the Maltese artists, thanks to also the efforts of Carmelo Attard Cassar, who used to teach art history and was a collector also of artworks of these artists. He invited them to exhibit an exhibition called Paintings from Malta, which took place in 58 in the summer months. And this took place at the Commonwealth Institute in South Kensington in England in 58. Eventually, this will lead to the 29th Biennale di Venezia exhibition. So you start realizing in our history that our artists are not only working on a local scale, which was already something very important, but they were also going abroad, which at that time was quite a novelty. I mean, I'm talking before internet and all the things that we have today, where the world has become essentially a village. Today, it doesn't matter where you live, because you can remain electronically and digitally connected wherever you are. Having said all this, we come to a major breakthrough back in 1945. And this is because how are we going to bridge the development of modernism in Malta when you have predominantly the Catholic Church, who still needed a lot of paintings, particularly for churches that were partially or totally destroyed during the ravages of the Second World War and needed to be redecorated. So the church was still more interested in traditional, old style paintings, like the ones I discussed when I start Volume 1 with Giuseppe Calì and Lazzaro Pisani. And I make it very clear that the modern movement could not even start until these two artists were both dead. Then we could actually start, because they literally dominated the scene. And maybe we are still seeing this effect in our churches today. At any rate, Anton Inglot in the parish church of Imsida, he managed to make a very important contribution, where he managed somehow to bridge this new style of modernism and simplicity, very little color, mostly gray, white, and ochres, and at the same time with a great sense of spirituality. This is found particularly in his painting The Death of St. Joseph in the parish church of Imsida. Unfortunately, Inglot died without having completed the entire project of Imsida, and then Vincremona will be called in. Then Vincremona found himself in a very difficult position, because he had to be himself as an artist, but at the same time complement with Inglot and still bridge this problem that we have of modernism and the traditional tastes of the church in Malta. And what Cremona managed to do is outstanding, which we find in different churches in Malta, but I think the highlight remains in St. Gaetan's Church, parish church in Hambrun, where we see how Cremona managed to put an art form that is fresh, that is with a lot of graphic design issues, including the predominance of gold as a color, and he managed to create a new style which somehow made it acceptable even to the church authorities to start to see a little bit of modernism in our churches. This eventually will lead to other works such as the St. Nicholas of Tolentino, stained glass by Antoine Camilleri in St. Augustinian Community Church in Tarshim, done in 1970. We also have another revival back in the 60s when there were the centenary of the St. Paul celebrations, where again Cremona produced a lot of works for this particular celebration. And if we go to the Catholic Institute in Floriana, in Gonzi Hall, we have a frieze of some of the paintings that still survive from this period by Cremona, which show St. Paul preaching and St. Paul after the shipwreck in the year 60 AD to the Maltese people here. That was actually not a frieze, that was part of the stage decoration basement at the time. There were other works by Frank Portelli also for this particular period, and so on. Having established all of this, I start then in volume 2 to make the issue of the difference between artists who studied in Rome and those who started to go to Paris or go to London. And I start therefore to discuss the different artistic programs. And this education was paramount in encouraging more modernism. We have another exception again with Carmelo Mangione, who in 1930 up till 1933 decided to go and study in New York City at the Grand Central School of Art, a school which doesn't exist anymore, so I could not find those archives, but in New York City I did manage. In the archives library there, I managed to find the archives of the teachers who taught Mangione, what the program was about, and I also include these in my research. This brings me to the very end of the volume 2, where I discuss the presence of an extremely important British international artist by the name of Victor Pasmore. Victor Pasmore at some point decided to come and settle in Malta because of climate, because of the language, because of its easy access to fly to Britain whenever he needed to have an exhibition or go to his galleries, etc., Marlborough and so on, and therefore he will settle here and he will be very productive here. He will work very secluded in his farmhouse in Goudia, but soon he started to make friends, or Maltese artists started to seek him, particularly Gabriel Caruana, Antoine Camilleri, Professor Richard England, Prof. Peter Serracino-Anglot. So we start to see a lot of artists and other important people in different fields who make contact with this artist, and they start to see the importance of his work. This will have a great impact on Maltese artists, because if anything else, what Pasmore did, maybe without even his knowledge, he influenced not only the importance of abstract painting in Maltese art, but he actually encouraged it. And from that time onwards, particularly with the various exhibitions that he held in Malta, the most famous one I still believe is the one in 1970, which was held at the Malta Society of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce in Valletta, which all books of international repute about Pasmore still speak about this important exhibition that he had while he was living on the island. Having said that, this will bring a lot of new emergence of abstract painting in Malta in particular, and we have a special hall in our Musa Museum in Valletta where we see Victor Pasmore, some of his key works produced on the island, as well as surrounded by several Maltese artists of different generations who show that they continue to develop this new abstract language thanks to the efforts of Victor Pasmore and his presence on the island. There were many other more movements that took place, which I wanted to document as well, even if they are not very well known. Particularly, for example, Spectrum 67, which was born in 1967, extremely important is the group of the Artists Guild, which although it had a very short life, it had various exhibitions in London and in New York City, very successful. Many of their works were to help the Immigrants Commission in Valletta, near Castile, and this was run by the famous Maltese tenor Paul Asha. I discuss also another important art group by the name of Vision 74. And what is important with Vision 74 is that these groups also published, in inverted commas, because they were done by Gestetner at the time, like carbon copies as it were, but they used to type and give lectures and did some publications. This was called Folly pages, or sheets of information. They are extremely interesting. I managed to find them all. There weren't many, with contributions mostly from Cesar Attard, Neville Ferry, Joseph Calleja, the sculptor, and these were a lot of information put together. There is a very interesting one in particular, issue number 3 from February of 77, which already discusses important projects of what is going to happen with the ruins of the theater, of the Opera House in Valletta. This is in 1977, well before the project of Renzo Piano. I discussed also another publication called Arti. It was one of the first Maltese art journals which was ever published, and these are actually deposited at the Malta University. The volume 2 ends around 1980. So essentially in these 2 volumes I cover 80 years, just a little bit under 100 years, from 1900 till 1980. Why do I stop at 1980? I felt that in 1980 a new generation of artists was coming up, mostly the students of these famous pioneers. And also by 1980 we cannot keep on talking of modernism, but we have to start talking of contemporary or postmodernism at this time. Conclusion. The conclusion is that now we have a framework, now we have at least scholarly and documented the entire history of modernism. Yes, there are still a few gaps here and there. Definitely we still have many artists that we need to research, like Giorgio Preca, like Frank Portelli, like Bort Schwierer, like Samuel Bugeja, like many others. The list goes on endlessly. And this is where I continue to work. And this is my commitment to the project of these 2 volumes. I thank you for your attention. Bye-bye.